October 15, 2023. Barataria Bay, Louisiana. A team of marine archaeologists conducting a survey of hurricane damage to the coastal wetlands made a discovery that would solve one of the oldest mysteries in New Orleans' organized crime history. The researchers had been using side-scan sonar to map debris fields created by Hurricane Ida 2 years earlier, when their instruments detected an anomaly approximately 40 feet below the surface in a remote section of Bayou that had once been dry land. The object's dimensions suggested a vessel of significant size, perhaps 30 feet in length, lying on its side in the silt that had accumulated over decades of coastal subsidence. What they had found would prove to be far more than storm debris. The discovery site lay deep in the labyrinthine waterways of Jefferson Parish, in an area that had been marshland in the 1950s, but had since been claimed by the rising waters of Barataria Bay. The specific location was accessible only by small boat, miles from any inhabited land, surrounded by the skeletal remains of cypress trees that had drowned as saltwater intrusion transformed the landscape. Few people ventured into this remote corner of the Louisiana coast, which made it an ideal resting place for something that was never meant to be found. The sonar imagery showed a shape that was unmistakably a cabin cruiser, its hull remarkably intact despite 66 years beneath the water. The Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries was notified of the discovery, and officials quickly determined that the vessel did not match any recent reports of lost or abandoned boats. The depth at which it lay, combined with the sediment accumulation visible in the sonar images, suggested the boat had been submerged for many decades. Historical records were consulted, and marine archaeologists began the process of identifying the vessel type and approximate age. When initial findings suggested a 1950s cruiser of considerable value, the investigation took on new urgency. Boats of that era did not simply sink in remote bayous without explanation. Recovery operations began on November 3, 2023. Involving a specialized salvage team equipped to work in the challenging conditions of the Louisiana coastal zone. The water was murky with suspended sediment, visibility measured in inches rather than feet. Strong currents, generated by tidal exchange, made diving dangerous, and the soft bottom threatened to swallow equipment and personnel alike. Divers who descended to examine the wreck reported a vessel covered in decades of marine growth. Its wooden hull surprisingly solid, despite the passage of time. The cabin structure remained largely intact, though the glass had long since shattered and the interior had filled with silt. The vessel was identified through its hull configuration and remaining hardware as a 1957 Chris Craft Constellation, a 35-foot cabin cruiser that had represented the pinnacle of American recreational boating in its era. The Constellation model had been built at the Chris Craft factory in Holland, Michigan, featuring mahogany planking over oak frames, twin gasoline engines, and accommodations for extended cruising. In 1957, such a vessel would have cost approximately $15,000, a sum that placed it firmly in the realm of the wealthy and the powerful. The boat's presence in this remote bayou raised immediate questions about how it had arrived there and who had owned it. The first indication that this was more than an ordinary boating accident came when divers examining the exterior of the hull discovered evidence of deliberate damage. Several large holes had been cut in the bottom of the boat below the waterline, holes too regular and precise to have been caused by impact or deterioration. Someone had intentionally scuttled this vessel, opening its hull to ensure it would sink quickly and completely. The placement of the holes suggested knowledge of boat construction, a deliberate effort to send the Constellation to the bottom with maximum efficiency. This had not been an accident or a storm casualty. This had been a planned disposal. Recovery of the vessel proceeded slowly over the following weeks, complicated by weather, tides, and the fragile condition of the hull. The boat was eventually raised using inflatable lift bags and transported to a facility in Lafitte where it could be examined in detail. as conservators began the painstaking process of removing accumulated sediment from the interior. They made discoveries that transformed this salvage operation into a criminal investigation. Human remains were found within the cabin, skeletal bones that had been preserved by the anaerobic conditions of the silty bottom. The Chris Craft Constellation had become a coffin for someone who had gone down with the ship. The Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office was contacted, and detectives specializing in cold cases arrived to examine the scene. The remains appeared to be those of a single adult male, though the condition of the bones and their scattered distribution within the cabin made immediate assessment difficult. A forensic anthropologist from Louisiana State University was brought in to supervise the recovery and analysis of the skeletal material. What emerged from that analysis would connect this sunken vessel to one of the most significant unsolved disappearances in the history of organized crime in Louisiana. A case that had remained open for 66 years without resolution. The identification process began with the vessel itself. Registration records from 1957 were searched, revealing that a Chris Craft Constellation matching the recovered boat's specifications had been registered to a corporation called Gulf Coast Enterprises, Incorporated, with an address in the French Quarter of New Orleans. Further research into Gulf Coast Enterprises revealed that the company had been a known front organization for gambling and vice operations during the 1950s. Its principals connected to the network of criminal activity that had flourished in Louisiana during that era. The boat had belonged to someone with money and connections to the underworld. The registered owner of the vessel was listed as Salvatore Vincent Toretti, a name that immediately resonated with historians of New Orleans organized crime. Toretti had been a significant figure in the city's criminal hierarchy during the 1950s, a man who had operated gambling establishments, managed loan sharking operations, and served as a liaison between New Orleans interests and national crime figures who maintained investments in Louisiana. He had disappeared without trace in September of 1957, his fate unknown despite extensive investigation at the time. The discovery of his boat, 66 years later, suggested that his fate was about to be revealed. The connection between the vessel and Toretti generated immediate media attention throughout Louisiana and beyond. The story of a sunken mob boat containing human remains captured public imagination, combining elements of true crime, maritime mystery, and the romantic mystique that had long surrounded New Orleans organized crime. Journalists researched Toretti's history, interviewing elderly residents who remembered the era and consulting historical records that documented his rise and sudden disappearance. The picture that emerged was of a man who had lived dangerously and died violently, his body consigned to the waters that had swallowed so many secrets over the years. The FBI's New Orleans field office was contacted to provide assistance with what had become a federal investigation into historical organized crime activity. Agents reviewed files that had been compiled on Toretti during the 1950s, surveillance reports and intelligence assessments that documented his activities and associations. The files revealed that Toretti had been under investigation at the time of his disappearance, suspected of involvement in narcotics trafficking and gambling operations that crossed state lines. His sudden vanishing had been noted at the time, but without evidence of foul play. The investigation had eventually gone cold. Now, 66 years later, evidence was finally emerging. The forensic examination of the remains recovered from the vessel required modern techniques that had not existed in 1957. DNA analysis offered the possibility of positive identification through comparison with any living relatives, while isotopic analysis of bone material could provide information about the victim's geographic origin and diet. The forensic anthropologist's preliminary assessment indicated a male between 40 and 50 years of age at death, with evidence of healed fractures consistent with a life that had included physical violence. The remains also showed signs of trauma that had occurred at or near the time of death, wounds that suggested the victim had not gone peacefully. The scene within the cabin told its own story of violence. When sediment was carefully removed from the interior, investigators found not only human remains, but artifacts that painted a picture of Toretti's final moments. A handgun was recovered from the Silt, a Colt revolver of the type popular in the 1950s. Its mechanism frozen by decades of corrosion. Spent shell casings were scattered across what had been the cabin floor. Most significantly, investigators found evidence of bullet impacts in the cabin's wooden structure. Impacts that suggested gunfire had been exchanged within the confined space of the cruiser before it went to the bottom. The investigation into what had happened aboard the Chris Craft Constellation in September of 1957 would require not just forensic science, but historical reconstruction. Understanding why Salvatore Toretti had died meant understanding the world in which he had operated, the alliances and rivalries that had characterized organized crime in Louisiana during that turbulent decade. The 1950s had been a period of both opportunity and danger for men in Toretti's position. A time when fortunes could be made and lost, when loyalty was valued above all else, and when betrayal was punished with absolute finality. Someone had decided that Toretti needed to disappear, and they had succeeded for 66 years. The Bayou had kept its secret through hurricanes and floods, through the transformation of the landscape from marsh to open water, through the deaths of everyone who had known the truth about that September night. The sediment that had buried the constellation had preserved evidence that would otherwise have been lost to time, protecting the vessel and its occupant from the forces of nature that consumed so much along this vulnerable coast. Now, finally, the waters were giving up their dead, and the story of Salvatore Toretti could be told. Detectives from the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office, Cold Case Unit, were assigned to lead the investigation, working alongside FBI agents and historians who specialized in the organized crime era. Their task was formidable: to reconstruct events that had occurred before most of them were born, to identify perpetrators who were almost certainly dead, and to provide closure for a case that had haunted law enforcement for more than 6 decades. The evidence recovered from the sunken cruiser would prove essential to this effort, fragments of the past preserved in silt and darkness, waiting to testify at last. The discovery in Barataria Bay was about to illuminate one of the darkest chapters in the history of organized crime in Louisiana. Salvatore Toretti had been murdered and sunk in his own boat, eliminated by forces within the criminal world he had inhabited. The identity of his killers and the reasons for his death had remained hidden beneath the waters for 66 years. But the Bayou, transformed by time and storms from the marsh it had once been, had finally revealed what it had been holding. The truth about September 1957 was about to surface. Before we continue with this investigation, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened in the bayous of Louisiana in September 1957 involves one of the most powerful, organized crime networks in American history. A wealthy gambling boss who made dangerous enemies, and a mahogany cabin cruiser that became a tomb for 66 years. The waters of Barataria Bay kept their secret through hurricanes, through the transformation of marshland into open sea, through the deaths of everyone who knew the truth. By the end of this story, you will understand how Salvatore Toretti was lured to his death, who pulled the triggers, and why it took 66 years for the Bayou to finally give up its dead. Salvatore Vincent Toretti was 47 years old in September of 1957, a heavy-set man who stood 5 feet, 10 inches tall, and weighed approximately 230 pounds. His dark hair had begun to thin and gray at the temples, and his face bore the marks of a life lived hard, including a distinctive scar above his left eyebrow from a knife fight in his youth. Those who knew him described Toretti as a man of contradictions, capable of great charm and sudden violence, generous to friends and merciless to enemies. He dressed expensively, favoring custom suits from a Bourbon Street tailor, and he wore gold jewelry that announced his success to anyone who cared to notice. In the world of New Orleans organized crime, appearance mattered. Born in 1910 in the lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans, Toretti was the son of Sicilian immigrants who had arrived in the city at the turn of the century. His father had worked on the docks, loading and unloading cargo in the brutal Louisiana heat, earning barely enough to support his growing family. Young Salvatore grew up surrounded by poverty and by the criminal enterprises that flourished in the immigrant neighborhoods, the numbers games and gambling parlors, and protection rackets that operated openly in a city where corruption was simply the cost of doing business. By the time he was 16, Toretti had dropped out of school and begun running errands for men whose names appeared regularly in police reports. Toretti's rise through the ranks of New Orleans organized crime was built on a foundation of reliability and controlled violence. He proved himself capable of handling difficult situations without creating unnecessary attention, a valuable skill in a city where the relationship between criminals and authorities was delicate and transactional. By his mid-20s, Toretti had earned the trust of figures connected to the Matranga organization, the crime family that had dominated New Orleans since the 19th century. He ran gambling operations in the French Quarter, collected debts for loan sharks, and demonstrated the combination of intelligence and brutality that advancement in his profession required. The 1940s brought both opportunity and transformation to Toretti's career. World War II drew millions of Americans into military service, creating labor shortages and disrupting traditional patterns of commerce, both legal and illegal. Toretti, classified as unfit for military service due to a childhood injury that had left him with a slight limp, remained in New Orleans and expanded his operations while competitors were overseas. He moved into the lucrative nightclub business, opening establishments that catered to servicemen on leave and civilians seeking entertainment in uncertain times. These clubs provided cover for gambling and prostitution operations that generated substantial profits. By the end of the war, Toretti had established himself as a significant figure in the New Orleans underworld, wealthy enough to purchase a home in Metairie, and influential enough to command respect from both criminals and the politicians they controlled. His marriage to Angela Marie Fontaine in 1946 brought him connections to an established New Orleans family with roots in both legitimate business and criminal enterprise. The couple had 3 children over the following years, a son named Vincent and daughters named Maria and Theresa. To his neighbors in Metairie, Toretti appeared to be a successful businessman with interests in restaurants and entertainment venues. The truth was considerably more complicated. The transition of power within the New Orleans crime family, following the deportation of Silvestro Carollo in 1950, created both opportunity and danger for men like Toretti. The emergence of Carlos Marcello as the dominant figure in Louisiana, organized crime, reshaped alliances and expectations throughout the region. Toretti had worked with various factions during the Carollo era, maintaining relationships that allowed him to operate across territorial boundaries. With Marcello's ascension, such flexibility became potentially problematic. Loyalty to the new boss was expected, and divided loyalties were viewed with suspicion. Toretti navigated these treacherous waters carefully, pledging allegiance to Marcello, while maintaining connections that might prove useful if circumstances changed. Toretti's primary legitimate business was a restaurant in the French Quarter called Café Palermo, an establishment that served traditional Sicilian cuisine and hosted private card games in its back rooms. The café had operated since 1948 and had become a gathering place for figures from both the criminal underworld and the political establishment. Judges, police captains, city councilmen, and state legislators dined alongside gamblers, loan sharks, and enforcers. The boundaries between legitimate and illegitimate power deliberately blurred. Toretti presided over this mixed company with the ease of a man who understood that everyone had something to sell and something to buy. His illegal operations extended well beyond the back rooms of Café Palermo. Toretti ran a network of gambling establishments throughout Jefferson Parish, from sophisticated casinos that catered to wealthy patrons to storefront operations that served working-class gamblers who could barely afford their losses. He controlled loan sharking operations that preyed on those same gamblers, trapping them in cycles of debt that could only be escaped through payment or violence. His reputation for collecting debts was built on a few carefully chosen examples of what happened to those who failed to pay, examples that circulated through the community and ensured that most borrowers found ways to meet their obligations. The Chris Craft constellation that would eventually become his tomb was purchased in the spring of 1957 from a dealer in Biloxi, Mississippi. Torretti paid approximately $16,000 in cash, acquiring a vessel that represented the finest in American recreational boating. The boat was 35 feet long, with a beam of 11 feet 6 inches, powered by twin 270 horsepower engines that could push it to speeds exceeding 30 knots. The mahogany planked hull gleamed with varnish, and the cabin was fitted with leather upholstery, a galley, and berths for overnight cruising. Torretti named the boat Angela Marie, after his wife, though she rarely accompanied him on his frequent trips into the bayous and along the Gulf Coast. Those trips served purposes beyond recreation. The waters of southern Louisiana provided opportunities for meetings that could not be observed by law enforcement, for the transport of contraband that could not be moved by road, and for conversations that needed to occur far from any possibility of surveillance. Torretti used the Angela Marie to meet with associates from Texas and Florida, to negotiate arrangements that benefited his operations, and to maintain the relationships that sustained his position in the criminal hierarchy. The boat was both a symbol of his success and a tool of his trade, visible evidence of his prosperity and practical means of conducting business away from prying eyes. In the months before his disappearance, Torretti had become involved in a dispute over gambling territories that had created tensions with figures loyal to Carlos Marcello. The specific details of this conflict remained murky, even decades later, but it appeared to involve Torretti's expansion into areas that others considered their exclusive domain. Marcello had built his empire on the principle of territorial respect, and violations of that principle were taken seriously. Whether Torretti had deliberately challenged established boundaries or had simply blundered into someone else's territory was unclear. What was clear was that he had made enemies among people who had the power and will to eliminate threats. Torretti's wife Angela would later recall that her husband had seemed troubled during the summer of 1957, preoccupied with concerns he would not share with her. He had increased security at Café Palermo, hiring additional men to watch the front and back entrances. He had begun varying his daily routine, taking different routes to and from his regular destinations. These were the behaviors of a man who feared for his safety, who had received warnings or perceived threats that prompted caution. Angela had asked what was wrong, and Salvatore had assured her that everything was fine, that he was simply being careful. It was the last significant conversation they would have. The events of September 19, 1957, began ordinarily enough. Torretti left his Metairie home at approximately 9 o'clock in the morning, telling Angela he had business to attend to and would return by evening. He drove to Café Palermo, where he spent several hours meeting with associates and attending to the restaurant's operations. At approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he left the café and drove to the marina in Lafitte, where the Angela Marie was moored. Several witnesses saw him preparing the boat for departure, loading supplies, and checking the engines. He cast off at approximately 4 o'clock, heading into the waterways of Barataria Bay. Angela Torretti became concerned when her husband failed to return home that evening. By the following morning, when he had still not appeared and could not be reached, she contacted his associates, who began making inquiries. The boat was discovered missing from its slip at the marina, but no one knew where Torretti had intended to go or whom he had planned to meet. A search was organized, boats fanning out through the bayous and bays, but the vast expanse of Louisiana's coastal waters made comprehensive searching impossible. Days passed, then weeks, with no sign of Torretti or the Angela Marie. The official investigation treated Torretti's disappearance as a potential boating accident, though investigators privately suspected foul play. The FBI, which had been monitoring Torretti's activities as part of a broader investigation into organized crime in Louisiana, was aware of the tensions that had surrounded him in the months before his vanishing. Agents interviewed associates and examined records, but the wall of silence that protected organized crime operations proved impenetrable. No one admitted to knowing anything, and no evidence emerged to indicate what had happened. The case went cold within months, filed away as one of many unsolved mysteries from that violent era. Angela Torretti waited years for news of her husband, refusing to accept that he might be dead without proof. She maintained the family home, raised their children, and kept Café Palermo operating as a memorial to Salvatore's memory. The restaurant gradually declined after her death in 1983, eventually closing in 1991. The children scattered: Vincent to Houston, Maria to Atlanta, Theresa to Chicago, each building lives far from the shadows that had defined their father's existence. None of them expected to ever learn what had happened to Salvatore Torretti. They had made peace with uncertainty as the only resolution available. The discovery of the Angela Marie in 2023 shattered that peace, replacing uncertainty with terrible confirmation. DNA analysis of the remains recovered from the vessel was compared with samples provided by Torretti's surviving children, now elderly themselves. The match was conclusive. The bones in the sunken cabin cruiser were those of Salvatore Vincent Torretti, dead for 66 years, finally identified through technology that had not existed when he disappeared. The family's long wait for answers was over, though the answers brought grief as much as closure. They knew now that their father had been murdered, his body consigned to the waters that had hidden it for more than 6 decades. The evidence recovered from the Angela Marie would tell the story of Torretti's final hours, a narrative written in bullet holes and bone fragments, and the deliberate damage to the hull that had sent the vessel to the bottom. Understanding why he had died would require reconstructing the alliances and enmities that had characterized organized crime in 1957 Louisiana, the hidden conflicts and calculated decisions that had resulted in his execution. 66 years after his murder, Salvatore Torretti was finally going to have his story told. The investigation into Salvatore Torretti's disappearance in September of 1957 was complicated from the beginning by the nature of the victim and the world in which he had operated. The New Orleans Police Department's initial inquiry treated the case as a missing persons report, though detectives privately suspected that Torretti had met with foul play. The challenge was not determining whether a crime had occurred, but rather penetrating the wall of silence that surrounded organized crime operations in Louisiana. Associates who might have known something were unwilling to speak, and witnesses who might have seen something were reluctant to come forward. In the criminal underworld, cooperation with law enforcement carried penalties far more severe than any legal consequence. The FBI's New Orleans field office had been monitoring Torretti as part of a broader investigation into gambling and racketeering in the region, but surveillance had not been comprehensive enough to document his movements on the day he disappeared. Agents reviewed what intelligence they had, searching for indications of conflicts or threats that might have precipitated violence. The picture that emerged was of a man caught between competing interests, someone who had tried to maintain independence in an environment that increasingly demanded exclusive loyalty. Torretti had made enemies, but identifying which enemy had acted against him proved impossible, without inside information that no one was willing to provide. Within the organized crime community itself, Torretti's disappearance was understood as a message, a demonstration of what happened to those who overstepped their bounds or failed to show proper respect to established authority. The silence that greeted investigators was not merely self-protection but active complicity, a collective decision to ensure that whatever had happened to Torretti remained unknown. Men who had worked with him, who had shared meals and conducted business, and perhaps even participated in his elimination, maintained absolute denial of any knowledge. The code of silence held, as it almost always did, in matters involving violence within the organization. Law enforcement investigators developed several theories about what had happened to Torretti. The first theory suggested that he had been killed by rivals within the New Orleans organization who viewed him as a threat to their positions or territories. The second theory proposed that Torretti had been eliminated on orders from Carlos Marcello himself, punishment for some transgression against the boss's authority or interests. A third theory suggested involvement by criminal figures from outside Louisiana, perhaps associates from Texas or Florida with whom Toretti had been conducting business that had gone wrong. Each theory had supporting evidence, but none could be confirmed without witnesses willing to testify. The possibility that Toretti had simply fled, abandoning his family and business to start a new life elsewhere, was considered and largely dismissed. His accounts showed no unusual withdrawals in the days before his disappearance, and he had left behind significant assets that would have been difficult to abandon voluntarily. Moreover, his reputation suggested a man too proud to run, someone who would have faced threats directly rather than fleeing from them. The deliberate scuttling of his boat, discovered 66 years later, confirmed what investigators had long suspected. Toretti had not left voluntarily. He had been killed and disposed of with calculated efficiency. By the end of 1957, the active investigation had essentially stalled. Without witnesses, without physical evidence, without a body, prosecutors had no basis for bringing charges against anyone. The case was not officially closed, but was relegated to inactive status, one of many unsolved crimes from an era when organized crime operated with near impunity in Louisiana. Detectives who had worked the case moved on to other investigations, retired, or died, taking their accumulated knowledge and suspicions with them. The official file on Salvatore Toretti grew dusty in police storage, periodically reviewed but never substantially advanced. The years following Toretti's disappearance saw significant changes in the landscape of organized crime in Louisiana. Carlos Marcello consolidated his control over criminal operations throughout the state and into neighboring Texas, building an empire that would endure for decades. The men who had been Toretti's contemporaries aged and died, some of natural causes and some by violence, their secrets going with them to their graves. The younger generation that replaced them had no direct knowledge of what had happened in September 1957, knowing only that certain names were not to be spoken and certain questions were not to be asked. The 1960s brought increased federal attention to organized crime nationwide, sparked in part by the Kennedy administration's aggressive prosecution of mob figures. Carlos Marcello himself was briefly deported to Guatemala in 1961, though he returned to the United States within months and resumed control of his organization. The FBI intensified surveillance of Louisiana. Organized crime, generating thousands of pages of reports and intelligence assessments. None of this scrutiny produced new information about Toretti's fate. The case remained dormant, a cold mystery from a violent past that seemed unlikely ever to be solved. Angela Toretti never remarried after her husband's disappearance. She maintained the legal fiction that Salvatore might still be alive, refusing to have him declared dead, preserving his estate and businesses against the possibility of his return. This refusal to accept his death was partly emotional, the desperate hope of a woman who could not let go, but it was also practical. Declaring Salvatore dead would have triggered legal proceedings and tax obligations that Angela preferred to avoid. The ambiguity of his status served her purposes, allowing her to operate his businesses and manage his affairs without the complications that a formal death declaration would have created. Their son Vincent grew up in the shadow of his father's disappearance, old enough at 12 to understand that something terrible had happened, but too young to fully comprehend the world in which his father had operated. As he matured, Vincent learned more about Salvatore's true profession, knowledge that complicated his feelings about his missing father. He chose a different path, pursuing education and eventually becoming an accountant in Houston, building a life that kept him far from the criminal enterprises that had defined his father's existence. His sisters followed similar trajectories, Maria becoming a teacher in Atlanta and Teresa a nurse in Chicago, each putting distance between themselves and New Orleans. The physical landscape where Toretti had met his end changed dramatically over the decades following his disappearance. Coastal Louisiana was losing land at an alarming rate, the combined effects of subsidence, erosion, and sea level rise transforming marshes into open water. The area of Barataria Bay, where the Angela Marie had been scuttled in 1957, had been marsh when Toretti died, accessible by boat through narrow waterways that wound through tall grasses. By the 1980s, much of that marsh had vanished, replaced by open water that deepened with each passing year. The vessel, that had been hidden in shallow sediment, was gradually buried deeper as the environment around it transformed. The New Orleans organized crime world itself was changing as the 20th century progressed. The old ways of operating, the personal relationships and traditional structures that had characterized the Marcello era, gave way to new arrangements and new players. Drug trafficking became increasingly central to criminal profits, bringing new organizations and new forms of violence to the region. The Italian-American mob that had dominated New Orleans for nearly a century saw its influence wane, challenged by competitors and weakened by federal prosecutions. By the time Carlos Marcello died in 1993, the world he had ruled was already fading into history. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 devastated the Louisiana coast, reshaping communities and landscapes throughout the region. The storm surge penetrated deep into Barataria Bay, rearranging sediments and debris across the seafloor. Whether the Angela Marie was disturbed by Katrina's violence could not be determined, but the hurricane certainly altered the environment in which the vessel lay hidden. The coordinates where she had been scuttled in 1957 no longer corresponded to recognizable features. The landmarks that might once have marked the location long since washed away or drowned beneath rising waters. Advances in technology during the early 21st century created new possibilities for solving cold cases that had once seemed hopeless. DNA analysis allowed identification of remains that had previously been unidentifiable. Digital databases connected information across jurisdictions in ways that had been impossible with paper records. Cold case units formed in police departments nationwide, applying new tools to old mysteries. The Toretti case was periodically reviewed by these units, but without physical evidence to analyze, technological advances offered little help. What was needed was the recovery of evidence that had been hidden for decades, evidence that everyone assumed would never be found. The marine archaeologists who discovered the wreck of the Angela Marie in October of 2023 were not looking for evidence of organized crime. Their survey of hurricane damage had purely scientific purposes, documenting changes to the coastal environment and assessing impacts to historical resources in the affected areas. The anomaly detected by their sonar equipment was initially assumed to be the breeze from more recent storms, perhaps a fishing vessel lost in Hurricane Ida, or one of the countless boats that disappeared in Louisiana's treacherous waters each year. Only when the shape and size of the object suggested a larger vessel did the researchers consider that they might have found something of historical significance. The recovery operation that began in November 2023 drew on expertise from multiple agencies and institutions. Marine archaeologists supervised the documentation of the wreck site, ensuring that evidence was preserved and recorded according to professional standards. Salvage specialists managed the technical challenges of raising a wooden vessel that had been submerged for 66 years. Law enforcement officials coordinated the criminal investigation aspects, recognizing that they were dealing with a probable homicide scene. The collaboration was unprecedented for a case of this age, bringing together resources that would not have been available even a few decades earlier. The condition of the Angela Marie exceeded expectations, a testament to both the quality of its original construction and the preservative properties of the anaerobic environment in which it had rested. The mahogany hull, though waterlogged and fragile, had not deteriorated to the point of collapse. Hardware and fittings remained in place, corroded but recognizable. Most significantly, the cabin had maintained enough structural integrity to protect the remains and artifacts within from the forces that might otherwise have scattered them across the seafloor. The vessel had served as a time capsule, preserving evidence of what had happened in September 1957. As investigators examined the recovered vessel and its contents, they began to reconstruct the sequence of events that had led to Toretti's death. The evidence suggested that he had not been alone on the Angela Marie that day, that others had accompanied him into the bayou. Whether these companions had been invited guests or uninvited executioners remained to be determined. The bullet impacts in the cabin structure indicated that gunfire had been exchanged, suggesting either a confrontation that escalated to violence or an execution that Toretti had attempted to resist. The final moments of his life had been violent and desperate. The forensic analysis of the remains recovered from the Angela Marie provided crucial information about how Toretti had died. Multiple gunshot wounds were identified, including impacts to the skull that had been immediately fatal. The pattern of wounds suggested that Toretti had been shot from multiple angles, consistent with multiple shooters, or a sustained attack that continued as he tried to escape. He had been given no chance to survive. The execution had been thorough and professional, carried out by individuals who knew how to kill and how to ensure their victim stayed dead. With the identity of the victim confirmed and the manner of death established, investigators turned to the question that had remained unanswered for 66 years. Who had killed Salvatore Toretti, and why? The passage of time meant that direct prosecution was almost certainly impossible. The perpetrators likely long dead themselves, but the historical record deserved completion, and the Toretti family deserved whatever closure could be provided. The investigation would continue, drawing on historical records, forensic evidence, and the accumulated knowledge of organized crime historians to finally answer the question of what had happened in Barataria Bay on September 19, 1957. The forensic investigation into the Angela Marie and its contents continued through the winter of 2023 and into the following year. Dr. Sarah Bergeron, the forensic anthropologist from Louisiana State University who supervised the examination of the remains, worked methodically through the evidence, documenting every fragment of bone and every artifact recovered from the vessel. Her analysis confirmed that the victim had been a male in his late 40s, consistent with Toretti's age at the time of his disappearance. The DNA comparison with samples provided by his surviving children established identity with certainty that would have been impossible using the technology available in 1957. The physical evidence recovered from the vessel painted a vivid picture of Toretti's final moments. 4 bullet wounds were identified in the skeletal remains, including 2 to the torso and 2 to the head. The positioning of the impacts suggested that Toretti had been shot first in the body, then finished with shots to the head as he fell or lay wounded. Shell casings recovered from the cabin floor included both .38 caliber and .45 caliber rounds, indicating that at least 2 weapons had been used in the attack. This evidence supported the theory that multiple shooters had participated in the execution, overwhelming any possibility of resistance. The Colt revolver recovered from the cabin was identified through serial number records as having been registered to Toretti himself, a weapon he had legally purchased in 1954. Ballistic analysis determined that this weapon had been fired during the incident, its cylinder holding 2 spent cartridges and 4 unfired rounds. Toretti had managed to return fire against his attackers, though apparently without effect. The presence of his own weapon, still in the cabin rather than taken by his killers, suggested either haste in their departure or deliberate placement to support a narrative of suicide or accident that ultimately proved unnecessary when the vessel and its contents disappeared beneath the water. Historical research, conducted in parallel with the forensic investigation, produced a more complete picture of the circumstances surrounding Toretti's death. FBI records from the 1950s, now declassified, revealed that Toretti had been engaged in a territorial dispute with Joseph Pareto, another significant figure in the New Orleans criminal hierarchy who controlled gambling operations in Orleans Parish. The conflict had escalated during the summer of 1957, with both men seeking support from Carlos Marcello for their respective positions. According to FBI intelligence, Marcello had initially attempted to mediate the dispute, but had grown frustrated with Toretti's unwillingness to compromise. The most revealing evidence came from a source that had remained hidden for decades. Among the documents recovered from a deceased organized crime associate in 2018 was a handwritten account of various events from the 1950s, apparently kept as insurance against potential betrayal. This document authenticated by handwriting experts and corroborated by details that had never been publicly known, described the planning and execution of Toretti's murder with chilling specificity. According to this account, Toretti had been lured to a meeting on his boat under the pretense of negotiating a resolution to the territorial dispute, only to be ambushed by men who had been waiting in another vessel. The account named 3 men as the actual killers: Anthony Greco, Frank Lamantia, and Vincent Ciortino, all known associates of Joseph Pareto. These 3 had followed Toretti's boat into the bayou, then come alongside under the guise of friendly contact. When they boarded the Angela Marie, they had opened fire immediately, giving Toretti no opportunity to negotiate or escape. The attack lasted only seconds, the concentrated firepower of 3 men with automatic weapons quickly overwhelming any resistance. Toretti died in the cabin of his beloved boat, cut down before he could reach the controls or dive overboard to escape. After confirming that Toretti was dead, his killers had scuttled the Angela Marie by cutting holes in the hull below the waterline. They transferred to their own vessel and departed, leaving the cabin cruiser to sink in a remote section of Bayou that they believed would never be searched. The choice of location had been deliberate, an area where the bottom was soft enough to swallow wreckage and where tidal action would help bury anything that settled there. Their plan had worked better than they could have imagined, the vessel remaining undiscovered for 66 years as the landscape around it transformed from marsh to open water. The 3 men identified as Toretti's killers had all died long before the Angela Marie was recovered. Anthony Greco was killed in a barroom dispute in 1963. Frank Lamantia died of a heart attack in 1978. Vincent Ciortino survived until 1992, when complications from emphysema ended his life in a Veterans Administration hospital. Joseph Pareto, who had ordered the killing, died in 1985, never having faced any legal consequences for his role in Toretti's murder. Carlos Marcello, who had apparently sanctioned the elimination, passed away in 1993, his empire already crumbling around him. Justice in the conventional sense was no longer possible. The investigation's conclusions were presented to the Toretti family in a private meeting in April of 2024. Vincent Toretti, now 79 years old, sat with his sisters Maria and Teresa as investigators explained what had happened to their father 66 years earlier. The emotions in that room were complex. Grief for a loss finally confirmed, anger at those who had escaped punishment, and a strange relief at finally knowing the truth after a lifetime of uncertainty. Vincent had spent 66 years wondering whether his father might somehow still be alive. Now he knew with certainty that his father had been murdered before Vincent had finished his first year of high school. The remains of Salvatore Vincent Toretti were released to his family following the conclusion of the forensic examination. A funeral mass was celebrated at St. Louis Cathedral in the French Quarter, the church where Toretti had been baptized and married, where his children had been christened and his wife had prayed for his return. The service drew both family members and historians of organized crime, curious observers who wanted to witness the conclusion of a mystery that had fascinated students of the era for decades. The priest who conducted the Mass spoke of redemption and the mercy that awaited all souls, avoiding mention of the circumstances that had brought Salvatore Toretti to his grave 66 years late. The burial took place at St. Louis Cemetery No. 3, where Angela Toretti had been interred in 1983. Salvatore was finally laid to rest beside the wife, who had waited 36 years for him without ever knowing what had happened. The elaborate above-ground tomb that Angela had purchased decades earlier now held both of them, reunited at last in the peculiar democracy of death. The inscription on the tomb was updated to include Salvatore's name and the dates of his birth and death. September 19, 1957, finally carved in stone as the day his life had ended. The Angela Marie, too damaged for restoration, but too historically significant for disposal, was donated to the Louisiana State Museum. Conservation specialists stabilized the waterlogged hull using techniques developed for preserving ancient shipwrecks, treating the wood with polymers that would prevent further deterioration. The vessel would eventually be displayed as part of an exhibit on organized crime in Louisiana, a tangible artifact from an era that had shaped the state's history in ways both visible and hidden. The bullet holes in the cabin structure remained visible, silent testimony to the violence that had occurred within. The case of Salvatore Toretti became a footnote in the larger history of organized crime in Louisiana. One story among many from an era when violence and corruption flourished in the shadows of New Orleans. Historians incorporated the new information into their accounts, adjusting narratives that had previously ended with Toretti's unexplained disappearance. The mystery that had lingered for 66 years was finally resolved. The questions that had haunted investigators and family members finally answered. The truth had emerged not through confession or investigation, but through the accidental discovery of evidence that nature had preserved beneath the waters of Barataria Bay. The transformation of Louisiana's coastal landscape that had buried the Angela Marie had also, eventually, revealed it. Rising waters and hurricane-driven surveys had combined to bring the vessel back to human attention after more than 6 decades of concealment. The same forces of nature that were destroying Louisiana's coast had delivered a form of justice that human institutions had been unable to provide. The Bayou had kept its secret for 66 years, then given it up to a generation equipped with tools and determination to finally understand what had happened in September 1957. The children of Salvatore Toretti returned to their respective cities after the funeral, carrying with them the closure they had sought for most of their lives. Vincent, Maria, and Teresa were elderly now. Their own children and grandchildren gathered around them. The mystery that had defined their family's history was finally resolved. They knew what had happened to their father, who had killed him, and why. The uncertainty that had shadowed their lives since childhood was replaced by a terrible certainty. But certainty nonetheless. They could finally mourn properly, finally let go of hope that had sustained and tormented them in equal measure for 66 years. Rest in peace, Salvatore Vincent Toretti. The waters that claimed you finally gave you back. Your family knows the truth now. After all these years of waiting, the men who killed you escaped earthly justice, but they could not escape the judgment that awaits all souls. The Bayou kept your secret for 66 years, but secrets do not last forever. You are finally where you should be. Beside Angela, at rest in the city where you were born, and where you lived and where you died. The long voyage is over. The Angela Marie has brought you home.